Hello and welcome to the first episode of AfriCafé in this year's edition. We are very happy to be back. I'm your host, Fatem Zarazouzou, and today we will tackle a timely issue with global implications, one that is especially critical for Africa, the United Nations funding crisis. In its 80th anniversary, the UN is facing a severe budget crisis that is challenging its ability to act on the ground. In response, the strategy is to do more with less. But is that feasible? The UN Secretary General has announced the UN 80 initiative, a plan to cut excess spending and focus available resources on the UN's most critical programs. Today, we will try to understand the UN funding crisis and, most importantly, what it means for our continent. To discuss this topic, I'm joined by two distinguished guests, Ambassador Mohamed Loulishki, Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South and former Permanent Representative of the Kingdom of Morocco to the UN. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
And Professor Norman Sampidja, an international relations scholar at Mohammed VI Polytechnic University. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
So to kick off our discussion, I would like to start with a general question to introduce our topic and understand better the funding crisis. Ambassador Loulishki, we know that over the past year, the UN has warned of an unprecedented liquidity crisis, with the June briefing projecting up to 30% drop in 2025 resources, threatening millions of people. So, Ambassador, how did we get here? Is it because of unpaid dues or because of larger mandates for the UN? And the second question would be, what remedies are available today to tackle this issue?
Okay, thank you. Well, this is a very relevant and, as you underlined, a timely issue that we are called to discuss in the middle of the 80th General Assembly. I will begin by saying that this is not the first time that the United Nations is facing this crisis. It's been going on for the last 40 or 45 years. And it stems from the fact that the superpowers see the United Nations and other international organizations not as a forum where everybody can cooperate in terms of solidarity, in terms of inclusiveness, but they see the international organization as an instrument to accomplish and to achieve their own national interests. So whenever these international organizations are serving the interests, then the superpowers are abiding by the rules of the organization. But when it doesn't coincide with their interests, they decide to simply overcome this hurdle and act unilaterally. The problem of the United Nations today stems from the fact that at the same time that its responsibilities, its objective are expanding, the major contributors are withholding their contribution. For example, for the 2024-25, so far, out of $3.5 billion of the regular budget, 1.7 billion have not been dispersed. And if you consider that the 10 most important contributors to the budget of the UN are covering 73% of the budget, when these countries decide either not to pay in full or to withhold part of their contribution, automatically you have problems. And here I would emphasize that the developing countries are completely innocent in this crisis. First, their contribution is very, very modest. And for example, the least developing countries are paying something like 0.001%. Okay, so whenever these superpowers decide to change or to reform the United Nations, and they have done it before, they withhold the part of their contribution, and paying their dues will become in exchange of the implementation of some radical reforms. Like, for example, I think the last time the United Nations has to fire 5,000 people from the secretariat of the headquarters in New York, because the United States requires that if you don't do that, we are not going to pay I'm not just mentioning the United States. For example, the second contributor to the budget of the UN, either the regular budget or the peacekeeping budget, is China. China in 2024 withhold its contribution until December 24, and then they paid it. So these are, let's say, the major problems. Now, what are the possible remedies? First, I think that giving some incentive to the countries to pay their dues in time, something that can be considered. Secondly, some adjustment of the contribution of countries, because the scale of contribution and assessment did not change drastically for the last 30 or 40 years. There is a committee that is working on that, but there is no, since they are working on the consensus basis, so they did not achieve anything. The United Nations is trying, for example, to use the residual budget of the peacekeeping operations that are discontinued or that are closed. There is a fund that has been established in 1946, but let's say the amount today is about $230 million. I'm not talking about billions. So it's not really, the UN still relies on the contributions of states, which is obligatory according to the Charter of the United Nations, but it is all, if I may say, it is hostage of the contribution of the main powers.
So the main powers are the biggest contributors, but the biggest, the countries that benefit the most of from the UN and the UN operations are more the developing countries of the Global South. We want to know, Professor Sampidja, what is the impact of this funding crisis of the UN on peacekeeping missions, on development programs in the Global South, but specifically on Africa?
Okay, no, thanks very much. Very interesting question, and just kind of to build on to what Ambassador Lishka has been talking about, we just kind of like touch on a few things. Yeah, basically the impact obviously it goes back to the UN introducing protection of civilians and expanding its mandate over time. So we've had an expansion of mandates. And so you have UN missions going in as stabilization missions, unlike the previous generations whereby they were just going in to keep the peace. And so now you have large-scale missions, having around 13,000 troops. You have, I think, the MONUSCO at one point was around 20,000 peacekeepers. And so you can see that the missions have expanded. But also what we're having is an increase in conflicts, intrastate conflicts, which obviously we have in the Sahel, the Lake Chad Basin, we have Central Africa, we have the Horn of Africa, we have moved down to East Africa, also you have issues. And so all of these issues basically have both peacekeeping and also humanitarian consequences. So we need to be able to have peacekeepers on ground, but also with peacekeepers, you need to expand their mandate to protect civilians. And so that means more investments. But what has happened over the years is that UN missions have been scaled down. New states basically telling the UN to go away, like we had in Mali. I think in Congo, so they tried to scale back the UN under MONUSCO. But then they asked for the UN to stay a bit because the situation was getting bad. So just a bit of background on that. So we can see that what we are having is that we have a lot of conflicts that are emerging. And so with the humanitarian situation, things around diseases also, forced displacement, you have humanitarian organizations working day and night trying to mitigate these challenges. So it's basically a two-pronged kind of like perspective that emerges. Peacekeeping on one hand, but also humanitarian kind of like assistance on the other. And in both cases, we have the cutting down of the budget leading to a cutback on most of these kind of like activities. World Food Program has cut back on most of the activities. I think they cut their budget by 50%. International Commission for Refugees has also cut, I think, around 40%, or even more. And so in this way, we have a dynamic whereby you have basically humanitarianism in retreat. Yeah, and if we move to peacekeeping, yes, the UN missions have been reduced. We have at least 4 on the continent, but also we do have sub-regional bodies engaging in peacekeeping. We have a SAMIM mission, which was in, I think, the SADC mission in Mozambique. Yeah, and so what happened is that they had to scale it back, and one of the reasons they gave was budgetary constraints. And so you can see that even though we had Resolution 2719, which basically allowed or gave an open door for the UN to support regional peacekeeping missions or peace support missions, with a cutback of around 25% of the budget, that is going to cause problems, for the missions. So they're going to scale back anyway. And so, yes, there's a scaling back. Even if we move into the ad hoc missions like Multinational Joint Task Force, which reports to the Peace and Security Council, also they've had to scale back. I mean, they've also reported budget constraints. So here, basically, what you're seeing is that humanitarianism, peacekeeping also moving back in retreat. We are going to protect less civilians. And so that means you're going to have more humanitarian catastrophes emerging. So these are the kind of like consequences we have, both on the regional intervention within the African Union, the ad hoc missions, which are also overseen by the African Union, but also the UN peacekeeping missions, which are also very vital to the whole process. And I think I can maybe stop there. Maybe we can have more discussions.
Okay, and maybe on the UN80 plan that Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, have suggested, did they mention anything about a restructuring of the peacekeeping missions and development programs?
Yes, I mean, one of the things they mentioned was looking at mandates, trying to restructure the mandates to see that they deal with issues around maybe redundancies in mandates, looking at duplication of roles. Such things are very important also to look into when you're looking at a mandate of the UN peacekeeping missions. And so in this way, also you look at overreach or mission creep, because if a mission is set out to do something, then they begin to do other things in the field. What the UN is trying to do is to cut back on that. But the challenge with that also is that mission creep doesn't arise because the UN wants to do it. The mission creep arises because there's a need. And so what's going to happen is that, yes, there's a scaling back, but at the same time, they're going to basically be very rigid in approach. So they're going to lose that fluidity and flexibility in dealing with issues on ground. And as you know, with peacekeeping missions on ground, the military situation can evolve very fast. We saw this in 2003 in the Ituri region, for example. It evolved very fast, and the peacekeepers didn't have the mandate, didn't have the equipment, and they couldn't protect civilians. And so, I think that's the challenge that they have. But one of the things that I picked up from the UN8 initiative was dealing with redundancies and repetitions and, all those things within the UN mandates.
Okay. So getting back to the geopolitics of this crisis, Ambassador, you've mentioned that the U.S. cutting or withholding its contributions to the UN budget is kind of strategic and serving maybe some diplomatic agendas of the U.S. But don't you think that this would also hit the U.S. influence inside the organization and inside the whole system that the UN embodies? And can other, like the rivals of the U.S., like China or Russia, or other big donors like Gulf donors, fill the gap and benefit from this crisis and from the withdrawal of the U.S.?
Well, maybe let me take just 1 minute before answering your question, because what is happening now, this restructuring in the UN Secretariat and this 20% cut in the budget, etc., will harm first and utmost Africa. African countries will really suffer because you have a combination of two things. One is the suppression of US aid that used to contribute, I think, more than $700 million or $800 million to the humanitarian and to the food security, etc., etc. This has been completely deleted. At the same time, you have a shrinking of the development assistance from the northern countries. 3, you have one of the major contributors in terms of voluntary contributions, European Union, that is facing problems within, that is forced to rearm itself and to begin by this budget that has been allocated of $800 billion plus $150 billion. That makes $1,000 billion just that to militarize again Europe. This will have also an effect on the contribution of the European Union, not only to the UN, but also to the African Union itself and to the peacekeeping operations that are under the umbrella of the African Union. To humanitarian situation that my colleague was referring to, most of the critical situations are unfortunately in Africa. When we have this protracted conflict, whether in Sudan, Central African Republic, or elsewhere, and where you have hundreds of thousands of people that are refugees in the neighboring countries or that are IDPs and they are in need. And if the US decide, for example, to cut from the UNHCR is planning to fire 4,000 to 5,000 aid. Imagine that all these volunteers that work in different countries in Africa and elsewhere who will disappear, who will not be able to contribute to alleviating the humanitarian situation in these countries. Well, I close this this parenthesis because I wanted really to emphasize the fact that the continent that will be most harmed is Africa and the civilian population. I don't think that the United States will see its power diminish or disappear because of this situation. This has been going on for a long time, and the United States will still continue to be obligated to pay 22% for the regular budget and 27% for the peacekeeping operations. They might withhold part of it, but because of their permanency of their membership in the Security Council, they have this responsibility also to pay more than the others. We used to see sometimes when the UN is facing similar situations, some countries that have the ambition to become also permanent member of the Security Council come in and, let's say, contributing to pay the difference while waiting for the US to pay their contribution. But today, even these countries are facing difficulties and facing problems. The only situation, unlikely, and I'm sure that it will not happen, where other countries will benefit from such situation, it's where if the United States decided to withdraw simply from the United Nations. But I don't think that this idea is floated or this idea can be even envisaged, because I still believe that the United States still benefits from the UN in one way or another.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your answer. So my question to you, Professor, is, do you think, drawing from the Ambassador's answer, do you think that this current crisis is only a financial problem, and as Ambassador has already said, the UN has been facing financial crisis since the 50s. But do you think that this current crisis is special? Do you think it's only about financial problems, or is it more of a legitimacy of the UN and the international the international world order that it evolves around it is being questioned?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Ambassador Lischke here. I mean, the UN has always had legitimate questions. I mean, if you look at the Cold War period, if you look at the post-Cold War period, these have been times of change. And the UN has kind of like proved resilient because it has faced different challenges. The end of the Cold War, obviously, have the rise of many conflicts, intrastate conflicts, which the UN was not designed to deal with. And then Boutros Ghali, and then later Brahimi, they came up with changes. They adopted. They adapted to the situation. So the UN has become kind of like resilient. So I don't think it's a legitimacy question per se. I think it's more like a changing international order also. But also changes within the UN are required. And so states are trying to put pressure on it to kind of like adapt to what they want. I mean, going by what Ambassador Lischke talked about. And this also feeds into the argument of self-interest, whereby states are self-interested, and so they will use their leverage to make sure they get what they want. But also they may be just looking internally. So they're basically, if you look at the US, America first, and so it's known that the US does not see the UN as a viable tool, but right now I think there are more pressing issues that maybe the current president wants to focus on than the UN. And so these are all kind of like dynamics that are emerging. And also, if you look at internal restructuring, I think it's something that was maybe required because what has happened that since the end of the Cold War, we've had more challenges, and also we've moved deeper into humanitarian activities, into stabilization missions. And so you can see that the UN is overstretched in terms of activities that it's engaging in. And so maybe what the states are doing is trying to kind of like push it back in line. Yeah, but also with the current interstate conflicts that are also emerging, the UN's legitimacy has been tested in that people have been calling for the UN asking, where are you? We have a war in Ukraine, where are you? In Gaza, asking where is the UN? And so, but also it goes back to the ultimate kind of like argument that the international organizations can only act as far as states are willing them to. And so in this way, the UN has been limited. But what we are seeing is that it has been resilient. And so I don't see it as a challenge of its legitimacy. I think it is still a relevant organization. It has survived a lot of things, especially the post-Cold War period, the post-9/11. And so we are seeing probably more kind of like resilience and more adaptation by the UN in the coming few years.
Okay, thank you so much for these words of hope. So on this note, we end our first episode. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Professor, for being with us today. And see you next time.